My name is Marcus, and this is exactly what my colleague Sarah told me happened to her 3 years ago. I asked her to write it down because the story has haunted me since she first shared it, and she finally agreed to let me pass it along. Sarah worked for the Maritime Heritage Foundation, specializing in historical preservation of coastal structures. She had 15 years of experience documenting lighthouses, fog signals, and life-saving stations all along the East Coast. She was methodical, thorough, and absolutely fearless when it came to exploring abandoned maritime buildings. That's why when she told me this story, I believed every word. It happened in October 2021, when the foundation received a request from a private collector who'd purchased an automated lighthouse station off the Maine coast. The buyer wanted a complete historical survey before converting it into a private retreat. The lighthouse sat on Gull's Rest Island, about 2 miles from the nearest inhabited land. The island was small, maybe 200 yards across at its widest point, with the lighthouse tower rising from a cluster of weathered buildings that had once housed the keeper and his family. The station had been automated in 1987 and completely deactivated in 2003. Since then, it had sat empty, except for the occasional Coast Guard maintenance visit. Sarah's assignment was straightforward. Spend 5 days on the island, photograph and catalog everything, document the condition of each structure, and compile a comprehensive report. She had done similar work dozens of times before, often alone, and she looked forward to the solitude. The Coast Guard Auxiliary dropped her off on a Tuesday morning in late October. The weather was crisp and clear, with calm seas and good visibility. She brought enough supplies for 6 days: a portable generator, camera equipment, measuring tools, and a satellite phone for emergencies. The island felt peaceful at first. The lighthouse tower stood about 40 feet tall, painted white with a red trim that had faded to rust-colored streaks. The keeper's house was a simple 2-story structure with boarded windows and a front door that still had its original brass hardware. Behind it sat a smaller oil house and a workshop that had been used for equipment maintenance. Sarah set up her base camp in the main room of the keeper's house. The interior was surprisingly well preserved. The room still contained some original furniture, including a large wooden table in the kitchen and built-in cabinets that held remnants of the last keeper's belongings. She found old log books, weather instruments, and even some personal items like photographs and letters. The first 2 days went smoothly. She photographed every room, measured dimensions, and documented the structural condition of each building. The lighthouse tower itself was in excellent shape. The spiral staircase was solid, and even the lens room at the top was intact, though the beacon had been removed years ago. On Wednesday evening, while reviewing her notes by lantern light, Sarah heard something that made her pause. It was the sound of the lighthouse beacon turning. Not the light itself, but the mechanical grinding of the rotation mechanism that had been designed to sweep the beam across the water. She knew the equipment had been disconnected decades ago, but the sound was unmistakable. She climbed the tower with her flashlight and found nothing unusual. The lens room was empty and silent. The rotation mechanism was clearly inoperable, with rust and corrosion throughout. She convinced herself it had been the wind moving something metal outside. Thursday morning brought heavy clouds and a steady drizzle. While documenting the oil house, Sarah discovered something the previous surveys had missed. Behind a stack of old equipment, there was a narrow door leading to a small cellar beneath the building. The door was unlocked, and her flashlight revealed a stone-lined room about 6 feet square. The space appeared to have been used for storage, with empty shelves along the walls and a few wooden crates in the corner. But what caught her attention was a series of marks carved into the stone wall. They were tally marks, hundreds of them, arranged in groups of 5. Below them, someone had carved a single word in rough letters: waiting. Sarah photographed the marks and made notes, but the discovery unsettled her. The lighthouse logs she had found made no mention of any cellar, and the marks seemed fresh despite the age of the building. That night, the weather worsened. Rain drummed against the windows, and the wind howled around the buildings. Sarah was reading through the old keeper's logs when she heard footsteps on the gravel outside. They were slow and deliberate, circling the house in a steady rhythm. She grabbed her flashlight and looked through the windows, but the darkness and rain made it impossible to see anything. The footsteps continued for nearly an hour, always maintaining the same pace, always following the same path around the building. When morning came, Sarah went outside to investigate. The ground around the house was soft from the rain, and she could see clear footprints in the mud. They were boot prints, size 10 or 11, forming a perfect circle around the keeper's house. The strange thing was that they appeared fresh, made during the night, but there was only one set, no path leading to or from the circle, as if whoever made them had simply appeared and vanished. Sarah decided to call for early extraction. She used the satellite phone to contact the foundation office and explained that weather conditions were making her work difficult. They arranged for a boat to pick her up Friday afternoon, a day earlier than planned. She spent Friday morning finishing her documentation, but she could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. Several times, she caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, but when she turned to look, nothing was there. Around noon, while photographing the interior of the lighthouse tower, Sarah heard voices. They seemed to be coming from the lens room above her, multiple people speaking in low, urgent tones. She climbed the stairs quickly, but the room was empty. As she stood in the lens room trying to make sense of what she had heard, Sarah noticed something new. Carved into the wooden frame of the window facing the mainland were more tally marks, fresh cuts in the old wood. And below them, in the same rough style as the marks in the cellar, someone had carved, "Still waiting." The boat arrived just after 2 p.m. As the crew helped Sarah load her equipment, the captain mentioned that the lighthouse had a strange reputation among local fishermen. He said some of them claimed to see lights in the tower on foggy nights, even though it had been dark for nearly 20 years. Sarah filed her report the following week. She documented the physical condition of all structures and noted the historical artifacts she had found. But she made no mention of the footsteps, the voices, or the mysterious carvings. The foundation passed her findings along to the new owner, who began renovation work the following spring. 6 months later, Sarah learned that the renovation had been abandoned. The contractor reported multiple equipment failures, unexplained accidents, and workers refusing to return to the island. The project was indefinitely postponed, and the lighthouse remains empty today. When I asked Sarah what she really thought happened on Gull's Rest Island, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said that some places hold on to their purpose long after they are supposed to stop serving it. She believes the lighthouse is still trying to guide someone home, still keeping watch for a ship that will never come. I tried to research the history of the lighthouse myself, but the records are incomplete. The last keeper left in 1987, but his name was redacted from most documents. Local maritime records mention several unexplained disappearances in the waters around Gull's Rest Island over the decades, but no details are available. The lighthouse still stands there, dark and empty, visible from the mainland on clear days. Sometimes I wonder if Sarah was right about places holding on to their purpose. And sometimes, on foggy nights when I drive along the coast road, I find myself looking out toward the island, almost expecting to see a light that should not be there. That is what disturbs me most. Not what Sarah experienced, but what she said about the lighthouse still keeping watch. Because if that is true, then someone or something is still out there in the dark, waiting to be guided home. My brother-in-law Marcus works for the Maritime Safety Agency, has for nearly 15 years. He's the most practical person you'll ever meet. Former Navy, methodical about everything, keeps detailed logs of his work assignments. Not the type to embellish stories or believe in anything he can't see with his own eyes. He told me this story during Christmas dinner in 2023. My sister had to leave the room halfway through because it was making her uncomfortable. Marcus only told it because I kept pushing him about why he'd requested a transfer to desk duty after spending his entire career on field assignments. This happened in the fall of 2021, when he was sent to Gull's Rest Light Station for routine maintenance. The lighthouse sits on a small rocky outcrop about 12 miles off the Oregon coast. It's completely isolated except for the automated beacon and a small keeper's quarters that houses maintenance crews during their rotations. The assignment was supposed to last 10 days. Marcus was partnered with a younger technician named David Chen, someone he'd worked with before on similar jobs. David was competent, quiet, and reliable. They'd maintained equipment together on 3 previous assignments without any issues. The first few days were standard. They tested the beacon rotation, cleaned the lens assembly, checked the emergency backup systems, and painted over rust spots on the exterior railings. The weather was gray and wet, typical for that time of year. The quarters were basic but functional, with 2 narrow beds, a small kitchen, and a radio for emergency contact. On the third night, Marcus woke up to complete silence. That was the first thing that seemed wrong. The beacon motor has a constant low hum when it's operating, something you get used to after a few days. But there was nothing, no mechanical sounds at all. He checked his watch. It was 3:15 in the morning. Marcus got up and looked out the window toward the beacon housing. The light was still flashing, but something about the rhythm seemed different. Instead of the standard 4-second intervals, it was pulsing in an irregular pattern. 3 quick flashes, then a long pause. 3 quick flashes, then a long pause. He woke David and they went up to check the control systems. Everything appeared normal. The timing mechanism showed the correct settings and the motor was running smoothly. But when they watched the actual light, it was definitely off pattern. Marcus reset the entire system and the beacon returned to its normal rhythm. David asked if he'd ever seen anything like that before, and Marcus said no. Timing systems can malfunction, but they usually stop working completely or speed up. They don't typically change to a different, consistent pattern. The next morning, Marcus contacted the mainland office to report the timing irregularity. His supervisor told him to monitor it closely and document any further anomalies. That night, they both stayed awake past midnight to observe the beacon, but it operated normally. On the 5th night, Marcus was awakened by the sound of the radio crackling to life. Static filled the room. Then a voice came through speaking in what sounded like Morse code. Marcus knows Morse from his Navy training, but this wasn't standard code. The rhythm was wrong, and the signals seemed to repeat the same pattern over and over. David was still asleep, so Marcus listened alone for about 10 minutes before the transmission stopped. He tried to respond but got no acknowledgement. When he checked the radio log the next morning, there was no record of any incoming transmission during the night. David started acting differently after that. He became withdrawn and stopped making conversation during their work. When Marcus asked if he was feeling all right, David said he was having trouble sleeping. He mentioned hearing sounds in the walls at night, like something moving around inside the structure. On the 7th night, they both heard it. A rhythmic tapping sound coming from somewhere inside the lighthouse tower. It started around 2 in the morning and continued for nearly an hour. The sound seemed to move up and down the interior walls, following the spiral staircase that led to the beacon room. Marcus wanted to investigate, but David refused to leave the quarters. He sat on his bed with his knees pulled up, staring at the wall and mumbling that something was trying to get inside. Marcus went up alone and found nothing. No signs of damage, no loose equipment that could be causing the noise. The tapping stopped as soon as he reached the beacon room. When he came back down, David was standing at the window, looking out at the rocks below the lighthouse. He said he'd seen someone down there, standing just at the edge of the water. Marcus looked but saw nothing except waves breaking against the stones. David didn't sleep that night. Marcus found him the next morning sitting in the same position by the window, still staring outside. When asked what he was looking at, David said the person was still there, just barely visible when the beacon light swept across the rocks. Marcus looked again. There was nothing. On the 9th night, the beacon failed completely. No light, no motor sounds, nothing. Marcus and David climbed up to investigate and found the lens assembly had been rotated manually to face inward toward the lighthouse structure instead of out to sea. The heavy lens housing had somehow been turned 180 degrees. The mechanism that controls the rotation was still locked in its normal position. There was no way the lens could have moved on its own, and it would have taken considerable force to turn it manually. Marcus examined the entire system, but found no mechanical explanation for what had happened. While they were working to realign the lens, David started talking to someone who wasn't there. He carried on a full conversation, responding to questions that Marcus couldn't hear, and nodding as if someone was standing right next to him. When Marcus asked who he was talking to, David looked confused and said he wasn't talking to anyone, but he kept glancing over his shoulder and whispering responses under his breath. That night, Marcus tried to stay awake to watch David, but around 4 in the morning, he was awakened by the sound of footsteps on the metal stairs leading up to the beacon. Slow, deliberate steps going up and then coming back down. David's bed was empty. Marcus called out but got no response. He waited for several minutes, then went to look for David. He found him standing in the beacon room, staring at the lens assembly. When Marcus asked what he was doing, David said someone had told him to check the light. David couldn't explain who had given him the instruction or how he'd gotten up there. He said he remembered being in bed. Then suddenly he was standing in the beacon room. The 10 minutes in between were completely blank. Marcus used the emergency radio to request immediate evacuation. He told the mainland office that David was having a medical emergency and needed to be removed from the lighthouse immediately. The response team said they would send a boat the following day, weather permitting. That final night, Marcus didn't sleep at all. He sat up watching David, who spent the entire night talking quietly to the empty air. Around dawn, David announced that he needed to fix the beacon one more time. He started walking toward the stairs, but Marcus blocked his path. David looked at him with completely blank eyes and said that the person upstairs was waiting for him. He tried to push past Marcus, but Marcus physically restrained him until the rescue boat arrived that afternoon. During the boat ride back to shore, David sat silently staring at his hands. The boat captain asked Marcus if they'd experienced any equipment problems, and Marcus said yes. They'd had some issues with the beacon timing. The captain nodded and mentioned that the Coast Guard had been receiving reports from ships in the area about irregular light patterns from Gull's Rest. Some vessels had reported seeing the beacon flash distress signals, but when the Coast Guard checked, the lighthouse appeared to be operating normally. Marcus asked when these reports had started, and the captain said about a week ago. David was hospitalized for psychological evaluation when they returned to shore. Marcus never spoke to him again, but heard from mutual colleagues that David had no memory of the last 3 days at the lighthouse. He was medically discharged and moved back home to live with his family. Marcus requested a transfer to administrative duties and hasn't returned to field maintenance since then. When I asked him if he believed something supernatural had happened at Gull's Rest, he said he didn't know what to believe. But he did tell me one more thing. About 6 months after the incident, he was reviewing maritime safety reports and found a historical record about Gull's Rest Light Station. In 1962, a maintenance worker named Thomas Brennan had been found dead at the base of the lighthouse tower. The official cause was listed as accidental fall, but the investigating officer noted that Brennan had been discovered with his arms positioned as if he were signaling with semaphore flags. The officer also noted that Brennan had been sending unauthorized radio transmissions for several days before his death, broadcasting the same Morse code pattern repeatedly. Marcus said the pattern matched exactly what he'd heard on the radio that night. The Gull's Rest Light Station was automated completely in 2022. No maintenance workers are sent there anymore. This happened during the winter of 2019. It was one of those bitter February nights when the wind cuts through you no matter how many layers you wear, and most sensible people stay indoors. I had been seeing Elena for about 3 months. We met through mutual friends at college, and she had this magnetic quality that drew people to her. She was the type who suggested midnight drives just to see where the road would take us. We live in a coastal town in Maine, about 40 minutes from the old Beacon Point Lighthouse. The lighthouse had been decommissioned for decades, standing abandoned on its rocky perch overlooking the Atlantic. Elena had mentioned it several times, saying she wanted to see it up close someday. That night, we were at my apartment watching an old movie when she suddenly turned to me with that mischievous look I'd come to recognize. She said we should drive out to the lighthouse right then and there. I reminded her that the property was fenced off and posted with no trespassing signs. But she just smiled and said that made it more interesting. There was something about the way she said it that made me want to follow her anywhere. So I grabbed my jacket and keys, and we headed out into the frigid night. The drive took us along winding coastal roads that seemed to grow narrower and more desolate with each mile. Elena navigated using her phone, directing me down increasingly remote paths until we finally reached a rusted gate marked with faded warning signs. She told me to park behind a cluster of pine trees where the car would not be visible from the road. I was nervous about this, but Elena seemed completely confident. She said she had researched the place online and that security patrols were rare, especially in winter. We climbed over the gate and started walking toward the lighthouse. The beam was no longer operational, but the tall white tower stood stark against the dark sky, visible in the moonlight. As we got closer, I could hear the waves crashing against the rocks below, and the wind howling through the metal framework that once supported the beacon. Elena led the way along a narrow path that wound around the lighthouse toward the cliff edge. She said she had read about a walking trail that followed the coastline, offering spectacular views during the day. At night, with only our phone flashlights to guide us, it felt far more treacherous. The path was made of weathered wooden planks and stone steps that had been carved into the cliff face decades ago. We moved carefully, testing each step before putting our full weight down. The sound of the ocean below seemed to grow louder as we progressed along the trail. About halfway around the lighthouse, Elena, who was walking ahead of me, suddenly stopped and called my name. When I caught up to her, she was pointing her light toward a section of the trail behind us. There, perhaps 30 feet back, stood a figure in dark clothing. At first, I thought it might be a park ranger or security guard. I called out, asking if we were allowed to be there, but received no response. The figure remained perfectly still, like a statue positioned on the rocky path. Elena whispered that we should keep moving and see if the person would follow us. As we continued along the cliff walk, I glanced back several times. Each time, the figure had moved to match our progress, maintaining the same distance behind us. The realization that someone was deliberately following us sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the winter air. I suggested we turn around and head back to the car, but Elena pointed out that would mean walking directly toward whoever was behind us. We pressed forward, hoping the trail would loop back to where we started. As we rounded a bend near the lighthouse, Elena grabbed my arm and pointed ahead. There was another figure standing motionless on the path in front of us, blocking our way forward. This person appeared to be wearing the same dark clothing as the one behind us. In the weak light from our phones, I could make out the general shape of a human form, but no details of the face or any distinguishing features. My heart started racing as I realized we were trapped between these two silent figures. I called out to the one in front of us, asking what they wanted, but again received no response. Neither figure moved or made any sound. Elena and I stood frozen on the narrow cliff path, unsure which direction to go. The wind seemed to be getting stronger, and I could hear loose rocks falling into the darkness below. After what felt like an eternity, I noticed there was a gap in the trail railing where we could climb up onto the grass near the lighthouse. I grabbed Elena's hand and helped her up over the railing. We scrambled through the tall grass, aiming for the lighthouse itself, hoping we could circle around it and reach the parking area where we had left the car. As we ran through the grass, I looked back toward the cliff trail. Both figures had begun moving in our direction, though they seemed to glide rather than walk normally. They moved with an unnatural smoothness that made my stomach turn. We reached the lighthouse and ran around to the opposite side, then sprinted toward the gate where we had entered the property. Behind us, I could hear what sounded like footsteps on gravel, but when I turned to look, I saw nothing but empty space between us and the lighthouse. We climbed over the gate and ran to the car. I fumbled with the keys while Elena kept watch behind us. As I started the engine, she let out a gasp and pointed toward the gate. The two dark figures were standing there perfectly still, watching us through the metal bars. I reversed quickly and drove away without looking back. Neither of us spoke during the entire drive home. When I finally dropped Elena off at her apartment, she kissed me goodnight and said she had enjoyed the adventure, but I could see in her eyes that she had been just as frightened as I was. We continued seeing each other for several more months after that night, but we never talked about what happened at the lighthouse. Eventually, we drifted apart when she transferred to a school in another state. Years later, I learned that Beacon Point Lighthouse had been the site of several unexplained disappearances over the decades. 3 lighthouse keepers had vanished without a trace between 1897 and 1923, and their bodies were never found. I have never returned to that place, and I never will. Some experiences leave a mark on you that time cannot erase. Whatever we encountered that night, I am grateful we escaped when we did.